right, so let's get started. It's my pleasure to introduce our seminar speaker, Hsieh. So she comes to us from the other side of the state. She actually warned us over lunch that she felt she was in enemy territory being an Eagles fan. And yeah. And
I'm sorry.
And she wondered why she's went to the Eagles, because she went to sophomore, graduated from there in 1999, and decided to stay in the Philadelphia area, go to the University of Pennsylvania, where she got her PhD in 2007. And I guess she liked the Eagles so much that she decided to stay there and become a professor at Drexel University. She's in the mechanical engineering department, and what she'll be talking to us today about is her work on I call it swarms, but she probably calls it more stuff than that.
I think if you call it more stuff than that, you can get money from other places as well. Thank you so much. It's a great pleasure to be here. This is my first time at RI, and it's great because you hear so much about RI. You get to meet the people as students you looked up to, and so it has been a wonderful, wonderful trip. So thanks again for having me. And I would actually say thanks again for everyone to show up, because from my understanding, this is the first day of spring break, and we're actually looking forward to warm weather. So I really appreciate everyone being here. So I usually like to start out my talk with some interesting facts. So all of us know that the ocean covers about 2/3 of the Earth's surface, right? It actually is the engine that drives worldwide weather climate systems. But some of these things that you may not be aware of, so 95% of the planet's water is actually in the ocean. The ocean contains 99% of our living space on the world. In addition to that, it is the largest repository of biodiversity as well as mineral resources. About 1/3, or roughly, of our oil that we use comes from offshore fields, okay? 90% of the trade between countries is actually transported by ship. So this picture that I have down here is giving you a snapshot of all the shipping routes around the world. And yet, depending on how you count, 80 to 95% of the ocean is still unexplored. So just to put this in context, in 2013, we spent roughly about $18 billion, so $18 billion on space exploration compared to $5 billion on ocean exploration, okay? We have better maps of the surface of Mars than we do of our ocean floors. So it's actually not surprising that the next X Prize challenge, right, is about building a submersible robot capable of mapping the ocean floor. And in fact, they want to map approximately 250 square kilometers of ocean floor at a maximum depth about 4,000 meters deep. And if you can do that in under 15 hours, Shell is going to write you a check for $6 million, okay? So of course there's a lot of interest, and I know people here like John as well as Michael has done work in actually, as well as George, right, in actually deploying robots in order to be able to study various oceanic as well as atmospheric processes. And so some examples is really using robots to be able to detect the onset of a harmful algae bloom, which can impact the local fishing industries. Some other things that people have done is using robots to be able to track contaminant dispersion, like oil spills or wastewater runoffs, okay? And then people here, there's a lot of people who do aerial vehicles, and people have actually used aerial drones and deploy them into hurricanes and be able to actually collect data so we can do a better job of predicting what the strength of the hurricane is, as well as what the trajectory of that hurricane will be. And so there's actually a lot of applications, right, that have a very significant ecological as well as economic impact. And so these are the kinds of applications. But there's a reason, right, why The next X Prize challenge is about going and doing exploration in the ocean. And that's because there are real challenges in working in this geophysical fluid environment, which the ocean is one of these things. So first of all, the ocean is really big. It takes up a lot of space. It is stochastic as well as time varying. And so these are all aspects that makes robotics hard in any setting. But more specific difficulties associated with that fluid environment includes, so the first thing is that your vehicle dynamics ends up being tightly coupled with the environmental dynamics, and this is because of that high inertia environment. And this is what makes controls hard, okay? You cannot rely on remote control because there is no reliable wireless communication between robots and a base station. Or even worse, between teams of robots, operating in that same workspace, okay? And then the last part is underwater perception is mostly near field. So if I was working with a man-made structure underwater, I can use sensors like sonars, which operate similar to laser rangefinders, and be able to sort of use those sonars to map the bottom of a ship, or be able to sense the presence of those structures. But in very similar fashion, so George told me that under certain circumstances, you can actually get these sonars to work better. But in general, if you're working in a natural sort of underwater environment, the sonars just don't do that well. And that's somewhat similar with our experiences on land with laser rangefinders. And then vision is even more challenging because if the water is murky, or the lighting conditions, so if it's dark in the area that you're interested in, then they're just, it would be very difficult to see. And then sometimes there might just not be anything particularly interesting to see. So as land-based animals, we're very comfortable about reasoning about environments, in terms of geometric structures. So here what I'm showing you is a dorm room scene and then the corresponding depth map that you get from an RGBD sensor. And what we can do with that data is you can process that data and extract and sort of segment that scene and be able to associate geometric shapes, with things like cushions and bookshelves and windows. And in a similar fashion, we can also reason about our environments in terms of topology. So anybody that gets a map, they can very quickly figure out what this free space is and then be able to figure out what the best route is to go from Pittsburgh to Philadelphia. So if we translate, so based on these experiences, it's really not surprising, that a lot of our robotics perception, planning, and control approaches, is grounded in our very human and very land-based view of the environment. So if we translate these experiences into that underwater environment, we would somehow sort of have this mistaken view that the ocean is just featureless open space. So geophysical fluids, they do exhibit coherent structures. These structures are important because they give us insight into the surrounding fluid dynamics, okay? And so the theme of my talk today is really about the structure of water and the importance of being able to understand that structure. And so hopefully, at the end of my talk, I will actually convince you that we can in fact look at our robots as this human-ocean interface and really use these robots to be able to better understand these structures, and by understanding these structures, be able to come back and actually design better strategies that helps us improve this human-ocean interface, or in other words, being able to improve the autonomy of these robots that have to operate in this dynamic as well as stochastic environment. So the work that I'm going to cover today is actually work by my current as well as my former students and this wonderful group of collaborators that includes applied mathematicians as well as physicists, oceanographers, as well as other roboticists. And so this is just sort of all the people that are involved. So just to let you know that this is not a single person effort, but really a very much a collaborative effort. So let's start with an example. Okay, and so going back to this X Prize challenge, so Shell has put up $6 million, and then NOAA is putting up an additional $1 million, and this is for the team that can design a robot that can autonomously sniff out the location of hydrothermal vents in the ocean. And so that really requires the robot to be able to sort of detect these chemical as well as biological signals. So what you're seeing here is actually a 2- and 3-dimensional computational simulation of the 2010 Deep Horizon oil spill. And so in very many, in a lot of sense, this simulation is somewhat similar to, a hydrothermal vent. And so this is work done by Alex Fabregat, who's a postdoc at City University of New York, who's working with Andrew Poge, who's a mathematician. And so there's a few things to keep in mind, and so a lot of these things that I'm going to talk about really translates to that example of being able to track the source of a hydrothermal vent. So the first thing you want to note is that this is actually a very complex computational fluid model, right? So the reason why it's very challenging is because you have various time as well as physical scales that you have to account for in order for you to actually capture all this very complex physics. So numerically speaking, this is a very hard model to run. So the other thing that was kind of interesting, at least for Alex and for Andrew, was that in 3 dimensions, what they had originally expected was that, at least from the leakage point, the way the plume was going to come out was going to take on this traditional sort of mushroom shape. And through these simulations, what they've now started to understand is actually there's more complicated dynamics, because what you're seeing is it's that plume actually precesses. And so say they have some idea of what exactly is causing that precession. But if you want to deploy a robot, right, in this environment and be able to sort of try and localize the source of that leakage, the one thing that is very challenging is the turbulence, essentially. Okay, so this is a very turbulent field, and the turbulence is hard to deal with because it really breaks up those continuous patches of plumes. Okay, which means that if you just apply a naive gradient descent search strategy, you're really not going to do very well because the signals are going to be extremely intermittent. Right, your detection of the presence of that plume is going to be very sporadic. So instead, what we're going to propose is to sort of, use an information-based search, okay? And the idea here is that somehow this strategy is going to be more robust to uncertainty than just applying a naive gradient descent. And so the way I'm going to do this, I'm going to pose this problem as trying to find a control strategy, right, that minimizes the Shannon entropy of the belief distribution for the location, the source location of that leak. And so here, for simplicity's sake, I'm using Shannon entropy. You can pick your favorite information theoretic metric. I know Nathan has done some of the work in this case, but I'm not going to go into the technical details, but just to let you know that if we actually go through the optimization, what ends up coming out is that we end up with a strategy that drives robots to locations where it is actually maximizes its expected rate of information gain about where that leakage point can be, okay? And so here what I'm showing you is a realization of one of these search trajectories. So portions of the trajectory that are highlighted in red shows locations where the robot was able to detect the plume, right? And so portions that are not highlighted are places where the robot loses track. So even though the robot does lose track, it is able to successfully find the source of that leak. Okay, so this is the part where you need to sort of look at me very, very suspiciously. And there's a reason why you need to be looking at me very suspiciously, because you're like, well, this is really not that hard of a problem, right? So The problem is, and I would say you're right, right? This is a relatively easy problem, not in terms of the computational fluid sense, but rather in terms of the robotic sense, since even though you have turbulence breaking things up, this is pretty much this unidirectional flow, right? And so really all I'm showing is an example of a robot doing some form of reactive planning and trying to figure out where best to go based on its current sensor reading, okay? But actually, so here's a question for everyone. Does anyone know how deep that Deepwater Horizon leakage point was back in 2010? Anybody? It was 1,600 meters deep, okay? Anybody want to give a guess as to what is the vertical extent of this simulation, keeping in mind that in CFD models, most of the time you actually have to apply, different length as well as time scaling in order to make sure that the numerics actually run.
10 meters?
So we have 10 meters. Anybody else?
5 meters?
You're getting close. So this, in fact, only goes up to 3 meters from that leakage point, okay? So obviously, at these scales, something doesn't quite sit right, okay? So at the smaller scales, things don't quite work out. What about at the larger scales, okay? So let's think about deploying an underwater robot into the ocean, and you want to be able to collect samples at different points in your workspace. And so what I'm going to do is I am going to use a double jar, this wind-driven double jar model to represent the ocean currents, okay? And I'm going to work on this in 2D just, for simplicity's sake. So the way you interpret those vectors is those are sort of the magnitude as well as direction of that ocean current. And what we're going to assume is the robot is going to start at that red triangle, and it's going to try and go to the yellow star. And instead of computing straight lines, what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to leverage those ocean currents and use those ocean currents to generate minimum energy or minimum travel time paths for my robots, okay? So again, I'm going to pose this as a trajectory generation problem where now DC is actually capturing the incremental cost along this path gamma. If I'm willing to do what we generally do when we come to path planning is if I'm willing to tessellate the space, right? Then now what I can do is apply any kind of Dijkstra, A-star, or graph-based search in order to compute my optimal trajectory, as long as I make sure that I employ the right heuristic, right? In that search process to really capture the incremental cost of going from one cell to the other. And so again, I'm just going to fly through the math a little bit because you can, it's not the most interesting part. But we actually have gone through and done this math and figure out what DC has to be if we're interested in computing minimum energy trajectories or minimum time trajectories for our underwater robots. So here what I'm going to show you are examples of our optimal trajectories, okay? And so this is, again, using that multi-jar model. So one thing to keep in mind is this model is going to come back. I'm going to leverage this model pretty often as a baseline because oceanographers, this is an analytical model that oceanographers like to use because it actually is used to describe large-scale ocean recirculation, and that is caused by the rotation of the Earth. So these are some examples. So again, at this point, you should look at me somewhat, sort of skeptically. And the reason is because there's something fundamentally unsatisfying about this, okay? For me to be able to actually solve this problem, I actually have to know what the ocean current is at every last point in my workspace, right? Which means that depending on how big of the workspace you're thinking about, this is a lot of data that you have to store. And potentially this, because you're sort of carrying all this data around, it also sort of can contribute to the amount of time that you're going to be spending on actually computing these paths. But even worse, so this is 2 minimum energy paths that we've computed using the ocean data off of the coast of Santa Barbara, California, okay? And so what you're seeing is the fact that I cannot continuously deform the red path to the blue path and vice versa, because these two paths are from two different homotopy classes, which means that when I actually sit down and compute those trajectories, I actually have to keep track of those two different classes, even though from my metrics perspective, they're essentially equivalent, okay? So again, at the large scales, there's something highly unsatisfying about the way we currently do things. So remember when I told you that the ocean does exhibit structure, right? But it's really about looking at the ocean through the right set of lenses, okay? So if I'm willing to look at the ocean through a dynamical systems lens, what I will actually see are these very specific class of coherent, these are coherent structures, and they're called Lagrangian coherent structures, or LCS. And LCS are important because they actually help us characterize transport and flows. So what are these things, okay? So LCS are characterized, the first thing to know is that they're characterized by these local measures of finite time Lyapunov exponents, or FTLEs. What FTLE is giving you is it's giving you a measure of how fast a region in that flow field is expanding. So the animation on your left-hand side shows the surface currents in Monterey Bay. And then the animation on the right-hand side shows the corresponding FTLE field, where now those LCS boundaries are denoted in red, okay? So basically, in 2 dimensions, right, so what we're seeing here is that these LCS are one-dimensional boundaries, okay? And the way to think about them is they are essentially time-varying extensions of a stable and unstable manifold of a saddle point from a sort of time-invariant dynamical system. Yes?
So water is effectively incompressible. Doesn't there have to be a conservation of volume somewhere here? It looks like it's being violated.
That's a very good question. So here, we're actually not worrying about, so this is a Lagrangian view, okay? And in fact, from this perspective, we're actually not doing mass balance. And so we're really only looking, so let me go into the computation of the FTLEs in a little bit, and maybe that, we can talk about that a little bit more.
I was expecting your answer to be something like you're only looking at a cross-section, so water rides and lower, allowing for mass.
Well, so the problem is FTLEs are computed without worrying about the mass balance, right?
Okay.
Yeah, and so FTLEs is really sort of abstracting that whole flow field into purely sort of a dynamical systems perspective, and so from there you've now sort of taken away some of these constraints, essentially. And so we're not, you're looking at the flow, not in terms of, you're just looking at it in terms of the vector field, basically. And sort of FTLEs are sort of tools from dynamical systems that apply regardless of what vector field you're actually looking at. Yeah. So that's really sort of, so we're not, that's the nice abstraction that we're sort of relying on in this particular case, rather than having to worry about these Navier-Stokes equations that I have to, that people solve. Yeah. Okay? But we can come back to that. Okay, so why are these important for robotics, right? So going back, so you can think about LCS as these basin boundaries, right? So if you look at the animation on the left-hand side, what you're seeing is the fact that particles seated on opposite sides of one of these coherent structures really don't mix over time. And so this is just showing you that they do, in fact, behave like basin boundaries. Back in 2005, Jerry Marsden's group from Caltech actually showed that time and fuel optimal paths in the ocean do correspond to these LCS boundaries. And all they did was they solved the trajectory generation problem by taking the historical current data into account. And the animation you're seeing here is just showing, right, the output trajectory superimposed on top of the FTLE field for Monterey Bay, and the magenta diamond is the robot, right, and the goal location is shown by the green X, okay? So this is kind of interesting, but what is the implication, right, in the context of the 2 examples that I went through, okay? So remember that in the first one, right, that plume really was only 3 meters tall, right? So the first question is, well, where does the oil go after those 3 meters? And so here what you're seeing is, again, this is a time-varying version of that double gyre model, and this is the FTLE field for that double gyre model. And what we did is we simulated a dispersion, sort of, there's a red X that's a little hard to see at the bottom. And then, so we're basically outputting these black particles at a fixed rate, okay? So this is kind of exciting because this is telling you that where those LCS boundaries are actually impacts where that oil ends up, right? Which means that if you know where the locations of these boundaries are, you actually have a way of predicting where that oil is going to end up getting dispersed to. At the larger scale, what this suggests is that I can, in fact, look at these LCS boundaries as a network of oceanic superhighways, right? So if these somehow correspond to time and fuel optimal paths, right? So then this is somehow telling me something about what are best navigation strategies. So what is exciting is this is now giving us a sense that maybe it is now possible for us to, right, using the right set of lens, using this dynamical systems lens, be able to think about generating and mapping, right, this very complex environment if we somehow can actually track these structures. And so the way I want to, so the argument here is that you can think about these LCS boundaries corresponding to things like walls and obstacles, right, and then the rest of the region as your obstacle-free space, like rooms, and then be able to sort of come out with a lower dimensional description for this very complex environment. But of course, there's a caveat. These are global structures, and they are only revealed if you can somehow sample the flow field across both space as well as time, okay? And so the problem, of course, is right now, all our data sets are these very low spatial temporal resolutions, which means that it's very difficult for you to be able to find these structures. But it actually makes sense, right? So if you're trying to do this, you can actually use a team of robots and deploy them out into the ocean, and then use their capabilities to be able to spread out, right, and collect that data, hopefully be able to process that data in a distributed fashion, and then be able to build a global description, right, of this environment, which then can then be updated in real time and then used to refine your deployment strategies, okay? And I usually like to show this movie before I sort of get into sort of how we actually will do this, only just to convince people that there is, in fact, a lot of these structures. And this is a simulation. So this is an animation that was done by NASA. So they took data across about 15 to 18 months back in 2005. And this is just satellite data, and basically sort of integrated all of that to show the surface currents across the globe. So if you go onto YouTube and just search for NASA's perpetual ocean, you can actually see sort of the animation around the entire globe, and you do see a lot of these structures. Okay, so how are we going to do this? Remember, we want to be able to track, right, these LCS boundaries using a team of robots. And so we're going to assume that we sort of have some number n. And right now, we're mostly working with kinematic models since the flows we're using a kinematic view of the flow. And so we're just going to assume that these robots have the ability to sort of control their heading, control their speed, and then they're also sort of being influenced by the surrounding flow field, okay? And so really, remember, so if these are sort of time-varying extensions of a stable and unstable manifold, right, of a saddle point, then there's also two kinds, right, of LCS, and these are repelling LCS or attracting LCS. So repelling LCS, again, are characterized by what we call these 4-time Lyapunov exponents. And so what do I mean by this? So what an FTLE is actually measuring is the divergence of locally sort of nearby trajectories over a finite window, which means that the way I go about computing this is I have to, given my flow field, I have to discretize that flow field into discrete spaces. I have to seed my particles and then advect them forward in time for a fixed period of time. At the end of the time, what I do is I have to compute the Cauchy-Green deformation tensor, and then the forward FTLE is actually a function of the largest eigenvalue of that Cauchy-Green deformation tensor, okay? So here's the problem. If I'm going to try and use a team of robots to be able to track these structures, I can't do this in real time. And the reason is because for me to be able to compute an FTLE, I actually need to have future data, right? Which means that the strategy that we came up with is actually going to not compute an FTLE, but instead use only local measurements of the flow field. And what we're going to do is we know the fact that the current speed along one of these LCS boundaries is always either maximal or minimal, depending if you're trying to track a repelling or an attracting LCS. Which means that if I can somehow ensure that my robot team can simultaneously sample across a boundary, right, and maintain what we call the saddle straddling formation, then what I can do is I can actually collect the data, integrate, sort of interpolate that data, and then figure out in what location, right, does the current actually get extremized, and then assume that that is in fact the boundary. So I can do this in a recursive fashion. The nice thing about this is I can even do this in a relatively low energy cost, because remember, this is a repelling structure, so if you're on close to the boundary, you get pushed away. So robots, right, on opposite sides will tend to leave each other. And so they can do this in a passive way. So I start out in the saddle straddling formation. I just follow the flow. I take my measurements. I figure out where the boundary is. I can propagate that information forward. And then in this fashion, if the robots get too far away, they just have to move closer together. But most of the time, they can actually operate in a purely passive way, okay? So this is essentially a recursive strategy where robots follow the flow. They separate, if they get too far apart, they move back together, and all the time they're collecting sort of measurements at each of their locations, and then they're just figuring out, you know, among the area that they're covering, what location has the highest velocity. So I can do this, and what we've done is that we've actually verified this using in simulation.
But they need to communicate something.
They do have to communicate.
So now there's the problem of the low bandwidth and all that.
Exactly that. And so the nice thing about this approach is the fact that, you know, all you need is sort of relative distance information to do the interpolation, and then you're sort of communicating very low amounts of information. You're absolutely right. There's actually a more interesting problem there, but let me come back to that sort of at the end. So we can verify this. This is the LCS boundary off of the coast of Santa Barbara, okay? And so here's the interesting thing. So when you actually look at real ocean data, you see that these structures tend to sort of, you know, separate. They're more interesting. There's more interesting dynamics there. Yes?
How does that lead robot know to turn right once it gets to that point?
So actually what you're seeing is eventually it loses track. And the reason, it knows how to, because of this interpolation scheme, right, so if the curve bends, it will know how to bend, right, but there's a bit of a lag. In this particular case, because the measurements are purely based on local measurements and not global information, what we're seeing is towards the end, these robots do in fact lose track. And part of the reason why they lose track is because we develop that tracking strategy assuming that there's a single boundary and that single boundary doesn't split. And so the downside of this approach is the fact that you can lose track and not realize that you're losing track. And part of this is because it's a purely local strategy. Yeah. And we'll come back to that, basically, okay? So I'm just going to go through this really quickly. Now, if you're tracking now the other type of coherent structures, which are those attracting coherent structures, right? The nice thing is now they're characterized by these backward time FTLEs. And this is the part where it's kind of neat because when you work with mathematicians, because they teach you these nice tricks. So if you run a normal system, so if you have a repelling structure, right? in a dynamical system, if you run the dynamical system backwards in time, right, that repelling structure becomes an attracting structure. So numerically speaking, the way you characterize these things is by doing a backward FTLE computation where you seed those particles, you advect the system backwards in time, right? Again, you compute that Cauchy-Green deformation tensor, and then the point that has the largest eigenvalue or FTLE, backward FTLE value, that actually gives you where the boundary is. So we can in fact do this with a team of robots now, because even though, right, when I track those repelling structures, I don't have future data, but I do have historical data, which means that I can use historical data, do this advection backwards in time, and then be able to essentially track those repelling structures. So this is very, very similar to what we did before, except now the nice thing about this approach and different from the previous approach is here we're actually using FTLE values and we're really doing the explicit computation of the FTLE, which means we have less chances, we are less likely to actually lose track, okay? And so we do this in a similar fashion, but let me just show you. And we have some theoretical results that we can talk about, but I'm not going to cover that. So here's an interesting thing. This is, again, the model. But the problem, of course, is it's very hard to find these natural structures because I have to download ocean data, I have to process that ocean data to figure out if there is, in fact, a structure for me, the type of structure that I want to track. So instead what we did is we took that Santa Barbara data and we again played this game where we now ran things backwards in time and essentially reversed the flow and turned what was originally a repelling coherent structure into a attracting structure and essentially validated our strategy using that same data set, but we sort of did some numeric tricks to make sure that it works. And so in this particular case, it's nice because when you run the data forwards in time, that structure striates, right? So when you run it backwards in time, we don't have that problem. So it's nice, and we show that we can actually do a better job of essentially tracking these boundaries. Okay, so I'm not going to go through the theoretical results. But here's the problem, right? So as roboticists, we always want to be able to validate things on more data. We always want to be able to talk about how good the quality of the data is, right? Can we somehow translate to sort of these more general cases? Can I better understand how these things sort of work when now I have sort of more interesting dynamics? And here the problem is the fact that, again, this is showing you the availability of ocean data that I can download across the regions of the US that is well instrumented enough, okay? And so this is just showing you the availability of data, right? So keep in mind, for me to even, the question is I'm tracking LCS structures, so I actually have to download the data set. I have to process that. I have to compute the FTLE field for that data set. And then if there's nothing, if I don't find any structure of interest, then I actually have to go back and download another data sets. And these data sets are huge.
So at what depth are these data?
So it depends.
Yeah. Or at what depth also these currents are coherent? I mean, they are.
So there's different, the coherent structures, right? So there's things that are coherent up top. A lot of these things are driven by the third dimension, the upwelling. Depending on what region you are, so the coherency could be different, depending on what length scales that you're looking at. And so a lot of this is, we know that they exist at various scales. A lot of it is dependent on the scale of the data that you collect. In most of the ROMS, so ROMS models that are dependent on high frequency radar data, the spatial resolution is about 2 kilometers apart. The temporal resolution is about 1 hour apart. For the larger data sets, the spatial resolution can be as far as 110 kilometers apart with the temporal resolution about 3 hours. And then the depth all just depends on the model, the numerical model, and how far they do the discretization to go in. So we had some models where we're looking at like 100 meters deep to 1,000. But the more data so it's just like the larger the scale, then the more data you have to deal with. And so this ends up being, so you end up spending a lot of time processing data that doesn't give you anything, right? And so I told my students, forget that. We're going to just bring the ocean into the lab. And so this is what I called our ocean in a box. Actually, it's 3 boxes. And so this is the low Reynolds number box, which is sort of housed at Cooper Union. We actually have a second tank now at Montclair State. And these are being taken care of by my collaborators, Phil Yecko and Eric Forgeston. And so essentially what you're seeing here is we're able to create, right, these coherent structures in a control laboratory setting. And what you're seeing here, this is actually a very low, this is, I believe, 50% glycerin and 50% water. And the coherent structure is really the dye, right, that is getting stretched out. And so we have a way to create sort of these multi-gyre-like flow fields where now we can control the kinds of structures we can create. In my lab at Drexel, our second box is a sort of 0.5 meter by 0.5 meter tank. It can, sustains up to about, this is, I think it's like 6 inches of water. And so again, we have these flow driving cylinders. So essentially think about these cylinders that you mount and then they just turn, right? And so by counter rotating these cylinders, you can again create those gyre-like flow fields. So the nice thing when you do fluids experiments now is you get to play with like fluorescent particles and then big fancy lasers to be able to extract the surface currents so that we can have ground truth. And then the last tank is our big 3 meter by 3 meter tank. Again, so this tank in theory can sustain about 1 meter deep of water. We can create, again, these controlled flows. The white particles there, those are particles, they're not foam. The reason why we put them in every time we run some of these experiments is so that we can actually visually see the flows that are being created. And so now we have this fleet of autonomous surface vehicles, since most of the phenomena we're studying is in 2 dimensions. And then we have this external motion capture system to be able to help us provide localization, because as many of you know, localization is actually quite challenging underwater. So now that we have the structure, we can actually run experiments, right? So we can create simulated flow fields like this particular experiment where we have robots at the very top and then sort of the resulting trajectories logged using our mocap system at the bottom to track our structures. So there's a reason why the tank is black. It does make it look a little fake, but the reason is because if you're trying to image the surface flows, then that actually makes allows us to be able to extract those particles a little bit easier. We can run sort of these mixed reality type experiments where you have 3 robots at the top, and then you can sort of simulate additional robots to actually really allow you to run experiments with larger numbers. Okay. We actually have robots that have flow sensors on them. So we have, so these are slightly bigger. The flow sensors are pretty straightforward. They're just essentially 2 dipsticks whose rotational axes are mounted sort of 90 degrees to one another. And this is just showing you the measurements that they're getting along the trajectory, where the trajectory is the red dotted line. And then the measurements from the onboard sensors are shown as those blue arrows, essentially. And we're seeing some nice correspondence between what we expect, right, the flows to be and what the robots are actually measuring. Okay, so
How big are the robots?
So the ones without the flow measurements are about 10 centimeters long. So yeah, so they literally sit in my palm, and then the ones that have the flow measurements are like 15 centimeters, and it's only because you have to displace a little bit more water because they're a little bit heavier.
And they have thrusters on them?
Yeah. So actually, I like to joke the fact that for every robot that you get from our lab, one of these little boats, you get a toy boat, a toy RC boat along with it, because the robots are so tiny that it's actually cheaper to buy the little toy RC boats and just take the thrusters off of them instead of actually manufacturing our own. So every little robot you have a companion, sort of RC toy. Yes?
Earlier in the previous image, you said those were measurements?
Yeah, so those are but they're filtered. So keep in mind that those are, yeah.
What's the sensor Or is it just ego sensors on there?
No. It's even simpler than that. So it's literally, one dipstick, right? And you mount it on an angular encoder, and you mount a second one. And so that's such that the rotation axes are sort of 90 degrees. And then because you have global position, so you can measure the global velocity, so you can actually do subtraction space. So you measure sort of the relative velocity of the water in one direction, relative velocity of the water in the other direction, and then using global velocity, you can back out what the flow measurement is. Yeah. No, because the tank is too small. So so first of all, there's no sensors that can actually be mounted on the robot and not just go straight to the bottom of the tank. And then the second thing is, because the tank is so shallow, all this sort of sound-based sensors that most people use actually don't work because there's too much ground interference. Yeah.
So your picture of your real big tank, white dots, make me think of all the trash floating in. So the fact that the trash congregates suggests that there are sinks and sources of the flow.
Absolutely. Yep.
But your mathematical model isn't going to have those, right?
Well, actually, we do have sinks. Okay, so the actual, let me just show you. It's actually right here. So this is actually a really good slide for that, because so the red lines are where those basin boundaries are. The orange are the saddle points, which means that there are sort of weak sinks right smack in the middle of the gyre.
But ultimately unstable, right? Stuff's going to leak out.
Yeah. So there is sort of like a limit cycle in between sort of that weak sink, right? The weak sink and the. So this is the part, and I would love to keep talking about this, because there has been, people have shown the fact that there's this big eddy off of the coast of South Africa, and the founding father of coherent structure work, George Haller, had mistakenly called it this like the black hole of the ocean or something like that. And so it is an extremely persistent eddy, and if you do sort of get caught into it, it takes you an extremely long time for you to sort of really escape this thing. And so he kind of got into some trouble with popular media when he used that term.
So if we think about the atmosphere and the jet stream, low-level phenomenon, we really do have a lot of stratification and three-dimensional rolling.
Yes.
Isn't this two-dimensional example just sort of way too simple?
Yes and no, okay? So there is a lot of stratification. And so based on the depth that you're working at, right? So the thing interesting about the ocean is at some depth, the current can go this way, some depth, the current can go that way. Depending on where you are, most of the time, the three-dimensional effect is somewhat weak in comparison to the two-dimensional effect, which means that if you are sort of operating within some kind of a sweet band, that two-dimensional sort of representation is okay. There is, however, this question of what happens when you now go from 2D to 3D. So in 2D, these boundaries are one-dimensional curves. In 3D, these boundaries become two-dimensional sheets. The current state-of-the-art of sort of literature in coherent structures sort of have some theory about what happens when you take these things to 3D. The problem is that all of that is still very much analytical model driven, right? And so we're not 100% sure in terms of experimentally what these things look like, And so this is the part where, people are only now slowly making that transition to study 2 dimensions to 3 dimensions. And so we are, sort of at the cusp of that, because our current NSF project, the hope is that, that is the problem that we're studying, is to trying to understand how to go from this 2D view of the world to this 3D view.
So the other complicating factor is it's not a homogeneous medium.
Oh, no, yeah.
So there's salinity, it's actually explicit boundaries and explicit thermal boundaries that submarines, for example, use to...
Absolutely. Yeah, and in these things we do translate, and one of the reasons why, one of the field experiments that we're promising to do for this NSF project is actually so to rather than think about tracking velocity fronts, which is essentially what these things are, we're going to be tracking salt wedges, right? So these are sort of right at the interface where the fresh water from rivers come into contact with the ocean. And essentially the idea here is, can we somehow think of, so that is sort of a salinity front, and that's a very three-dimensional salinity front. And so how do we take some of these strategies that is for velocity and thinking about translating that to sort of these other sort of properties that you see? Yep, absolutely. And so that's the kind of stuff that we are thinking about and trying to have a better understanding. Yep. Yes, any other questions? Okay. So here's, so I'm just going to wrap this up real quickly and sort of just to convince you. So the idea here is if we have this ability, right, to map these structures, okay, then what can we gain in terms of deployment? How do we use this structure to actually do a better job of, deploying our robots out there? And so again, I'm just showing you this double gyre model right here, and I'm going to work with the time invariant one here, and really think about sort of deploying a sensor here. But now instead of one of these underwater vehicles that can drive everywhere, I'm going to think about a relatively passive vehicle, right? Where now, and then I'm asking the question is, if I throw this particle in a particular location, where is it going to end up? And again, because I can treat these as sort of attractive sort of basin boundaries, if there's any kind of noise in the system, right, and if I get too close to the boundary, then that uncertainty can potentially kick me over to a neighboring region. So I can use that information to be able to synthesize sort of very low energy sort of strategies that allows me to jump from one gyre to another, because the idea here is that if all I have to do, right, is to jump into the neighboring gyre, then I just have to push myself very close to the boundary, slowly do this, and then, or I could just wait until I get close enough to a boundary and sort of gently kick myself over to the neighboring region, okay? And so this is sort of the strategy where if I'm trying to stay, and then if I'm within a sweet spot, I don't have to do anything. If I'm trying to stay inside and I'm too close to the boundary, I just have to push myself inward a little bit. And then if I'm trying to leave and I'm not close enough to the boundary, then I have to move closer to this boundary. And so we have some math and some theory that shows that this actually sort of works and works very well. So let me just show you some quick results here since I'm running out of time. So the neat thing is we've ran some experiments and using this exact strategy, and so we're looking at a single gyre, right, and how to leave that particular gyre. And what we've seen that if you just use this very, very simple actuation model for a single robot, you're looking at about a 13 to 50% savings in terms of control effort per vehicle, okay? And then we can do these studies. I'm not sure why that movie sort of disappeared. But so this is sort of, if you sort of push very, very gently, this is how much energy you spend per vehicle. If you're always pushing yourself, right, so you're just sort of, foot metal to the pedal to the metal, right, sort of all the way, then the amount of energy that you're using is that full amount, so it's the full height. So if you think about deploying teams of robots out into this environment, then you have to take the energy savings, right, this is a per vehicle energy saving, which means you think about the amount of energy you can save now, when you now multiply this by n times, especially when n is the larger number. So in fact, you can synthesize very energy efficient control strategies by leveraging sort of this information, because this is essentially the map that you have of your environment, okay? So So I'm coming to the end of the talk, and it's really about rethinking what we consider a map, right, in this very unique environment that we just don't necessarily have a good intuitive understanding of, okay? And so the grand vision, right, is really about how do you deploy these robots? How do you deploy these sensors out into this environment? Let them be able to collect this information, okay? How do you process that information so you can get this global description? And then how do you update, right? And how do you sort of bring that model back into your deployment strategy so that you can actually do a better job of synthesizing any kind of planning and control strategies for your robots. And so this is a part where sometimes, I talk to fluids, people are like, oh, this is not possible. It's just not possible. It's too big of a problem, right? And so, and just to convince you that maybe this is not such a crazy idea, I'm going to come back to this. So you can go online right now to that website. This is atmospheric data. So this is similar to that movie of NASA's Perpetual Ocean. But this is in the atmosphere. So this is wind data. And this is actually real-time data. So obviously I'm not showing you real-time because I don't have an internet connection here. But this is real-time data. It is actually integrated in the cloud. Real data is getting assimilated at different rates because you are, in fact, there's like ocean sea surface data as well as all the data from the different sensors, right? And so again, we're seeing a lot of these structures in the atmosphere. And so this is suggesting that there is a possibility that we can do this, okay? So again, this is at the large scale, and part of this is because of the sensing resolution we currently have. But really thinking about how do you do this at the scale of the missions that you're interested in deploying, okay? And so just to conclude, I'm just gonna show you, so we do have this really cool tank. I'm going to make sure my movies play. And so we have a lot of people come in and actually be able to run experiments. Guillaume Sartoretti actually spent a couple months in my lab, and so we're looking at distributed manipulation with a bunch of our little boats and sort of pushing big vessels about. And then Amanda Porak is a postdoc at Penn, and so we're actually looking at how do you sort of coordinate heterogeneous assets is sort of in these kinds of environments. And so if you have any interest in using a tank, feel free to contact me and sort of let me know. And you're more than welcome to come and sort of play with our robots. So even though I know you guys have much cooler robots to play here. So once again, thank you guys very, very much. And if you have any more questions.
So do we have any questions?
Does all this math stuff hold if you don't have, say, magnitude data, but you can tell that the relative velocity is pointing in this direction?
You mean the relative velocity of the flow field in relation to the robot?
Yeah.
Okay. So this is no, I don't think so. So here's like this is another caveat, right? So FTLEs are actually really, really good at picking, LCS. Unfortunately, it can actually give you false positives, okay? And that's just because if you have these very high shear regions in the flow, then it will register a high FTLE value, but that might not be an actual FTLE. And it's an actual LCS. And part of this is because the most recent theory is LCS, there is a correlation between those basin boundaries with geodesics. And that's sort of a little bit, that's sort of really the state-of-the-art theory by George Haller and they have new techniques to compute, right, LCS boundaries. The problem there is that they've only been, used with model, and it's not clear how to translate those techniques to data. And so we're not quite sure how to do that yet. In terms like taking the sort of latest state-of-the-art ways of computing things and translating that to data. And then I'll come back to you. Yes?
So it seems like these current structures can exchange particles. And going back to the original problem of finding something in ocean that is flowing with these currents, is in this structure, can you exploit the fact that they can exchange particles and there is a structure in how this exchange is happening? To which current is the useful one to follow? And which current can the robot give up and your team can just not map it all?
Right, and that's a really good question. So number one, be a little careful because there's very minimal mixing, okay, between particles on one side and the other side. But obviously, if you sort of hit a sort of, hyperbolic or stationary point at the end, then that sort of goes out the door. So that's a very good question. And unfortunately, I don't know what the right answer is there because of the fact that, our data is just so lossy right now, right? And so it really depends on what you're trying to do and what the mission is. And this is the part where I don't even know, so right now the nice thing is our trajectory generation sort of results are really having nice correspondence with the previous work, right, and with the theory. What I don't know, but we're still doing sort of this point-to-point, accounting of the current. And this is the part where we're sort of moving into, is actually asking this question of, instead of current data and you have LCS information, how do you use that to infer what the current is here so you can do planning? And that is still we're still sitting down and trying to think very deep thoughts on how to deal with that. Yeah, but that's an excellent question. Yes?
So I just want to come back to exploration of the ocean floor. I mean, especially at those depths, you're not going to have all of these kinds of currents mapped out. What do you think? I mean, we're going to have to find some way of mapping these currents before we can have these policies of great efficiency, or is there some way to sort of like map and explore at the same time?
I think there should be ways to map and explore at the same time, okay? I think the models are crappy, right? So these large PDE models are crappy. But they're a place to start, right? Which means that you can use some of that information, and depending on the region, some regions have better models than others. So that's basically a way to, as a prior, right, to start, and then use that, and then the question is, how do you assimilate the data into this? So I'm going to try and answer that question in conjunction with the point that Katya had brought up about the communications, right? Because these things are no mixed boundaries, there is this question of how does sound propagate across one of these things, right? And there is sort of, so it's well known that within sort of these depths that if you have to communicate, that there are these sound barriers that just you can't get across. And having some of this information helps in terms of how you plan, how you distribute those sensors so that you can at least maintain low levels of connectivity, right, even though it's low bandwidth. But then coming back to what you're saying is the fact that I think you can use some of that data, even though it's bad. But then the question is, if you use that data, if you can derive the right reduced order model, then as you're collecting data, you can potentially assimilate that. And because these are much lower order models than these complex PDEs, you now at least have a shot to be able to integrate that data into these sort of higher abstraction representations of your workspace in order to at least make it useful for you to continue on that exploration.
So how do birds do it? They don't ask other birds what way the wind's blowing.
Well, that's a good question. Well, I'm not sure.
Albatrosses return, I believe, to some nesting site, which
Yeah.
means they can go somewhere at some time even.
So I don't know the literature on birds that well. I know some of it is very much associated with the magnetic field of the Earth, right? But at least I know with fish, they have a lot of these, they have the ability to sense pressure differences along the body. So these are these lateral line sensors that they have.
Okay, so you can have a GPS and you can have a local measurement, but the question about your plans for navigating the ocean by just riding the currents, you need to know where the currents were.
Yeah.
Clearly there are these animals that have huge migrations where they stay aloft for months at a time. And they're doing what you want to do.
Yep.
How do they do it?
So I know that there's some studies with sharks, right? So I think some of that is like land-based. So they actually do land-based recognition. But I'm sure sort of Michael can probably sort of, and George can probably talk about this. I mean, I don't even know how I don't know how that translates to the way we're doing just sort of mapping coral reefs and just coming, even just coming back to the same coral reef 6 months apart. I mean, how do you even do the registration? It's a very challenging problem with our current sensing technology. And I think this is the part where, this is why we have to work with the science people, right, in order to be able to get new ideas and new ways about thinking of this problem.
So, a different topic. So, in reinforcement learning, we're getting to a point where we have these flow fields, And we want to fit large-scale functions to the flow fields to recognize these qualitative features. And I keep arguing that explicitly representing discontinuities of the flow, where flows in here go away from each other or come into each other, is very important. Are you guys using rather than just tracking the point-wise flow, using function approximation methods to go for the qualitative?
And that is exactly what I'm arguing that one should do. That's exactly what I'm saying that one needs to do, right? Is essentially you have to have that level of abstraction for you to even have a shot of doing any kind of, model predictive type strategies in these environments. It's just it's a very hard thing to convince people about, right? And the other thing, which is why going back to this question from before, is we're actually just, we really want to think about this problem is if you have a rough map of where these coherent structures are, how do you do the inference? And if you can do that, then now I have this ability, right, to really just do this representation. And so I would just say, like, we have looked into some of the techniques that people in fluids and dynamical systems use to do order reduction on their models. The problem is those are still very numerical. There's still very much this grid of points with velocity vectors associated. So we're trying to move exactly in that direction. And that's exactly the kind of arguments that I'm trying to convince my colleagues in oceanography and in fluids that we really have to think about the problem from that perspective.
So I'm interested in these Lagrangian constraint surfaces. So the two questions are, one is when we think about them in 3 dimensions, so it's a codimension 1 surface, it's a 2-dimensional surface. In the beginning of your talk, I was just imagining these things would just go straight down to the bottom, maybe they would wave as they go down, but more or less there's a preferred vertical direction. And then I'm wondering, do you know if some of them actually can curve over and have some points where their tangent space is horizontal or perhaps even envelop?
I think it's possible. I think it's absolutely possible. The problem, unfortunately, is I don't know, because it's just no one has collected data. Number one. Number two is everything that people have done has been sort of these sort of analytical models, right? So the theory that has been done has mostly been in analytical models. But I do think that in fact, so there are other structures that people study. And in that case, you can have things that essentially are sort of toroidal surfaces, sort of embedded, right, 3-dimensionals, where these all along that surface, it's very high current. So which means if your vehicle is trying to go through, you actually have to drill through the tori. And so my suspicion is yes, you should absolutely, and obviously it depends on the dynamics and the interaction between whatever other structures that there is at depth, but that. Absolutely, there should be things like that. Yeah.
And the other question is if you just look on the surface and you have these Lagrangian invariant structures, presumably you could sit on the flow of one and go around for a while, then perhaps have some escape velocity to get to the next one. So if you were to assign each of those stable regions, each of those regions, node and graph, would there be a connected graph on the whole planet, or is the graph just...
Oh, that's a good question. Yeah, I mean, we don't know. I mean, in the grid of jars, you can because it's so regular, right, using the analytical model. But that's a great question in terms of connectivity. The nice thing, though, is that, so again, if you may not have connectivity at this level, but by changing that level, you might get connectivity because you can have, at different depths, currents can go opposite directions, And so this is some of the work that Ryan Smith had done where he shows that, you can get sort of different types of controllability if you have control over that 3rd dimension. So you can so you may not have it, so I guess the question is now is like, how do you do this graph, if you only look at this in that one level, maybe not, but if you're willing to add that 3rd dimension, you might be able to get full connectivity.
Yeah, it's going to be cool to build something competitive with the wave glider where you can use very little information and go all around the world in a lot of time.
Yeah. No, and I think that's the nice thing because some of the optimization of the trajectories that we've done, it's actually really exciting for us because it sort of is reinforcing a lot of the previous results that we've seen, and we can play this game of like, you know, minimal control versus if you're just relying on the external noise in your system to sort of pushing around, and sort of and how do you switch from fully to, you know, minimum energy and then sort of waiting energy and time, and then, you know, all the way to the spectrum of minimum time, and then how this trajectory, you know, sort of morphs and deforms. But minimum energy tend to really definitely 100% correspond with coherent structures, and then, you know, minimum time chases after them, but it's not quite, they're slightly off. And so how does that reconcile as you change these different parameters? And that's one thing that we're trying to get a better handle of. Yep.
You got any more questions?
So I'm just sitting here watching your little water bugs. We got a lot of people interested in building stuff. Can you tell us a little more about that? Is that something your group produces, or buy commercially, or what?
No, so we actually build our own boats, and so the most expensive part, so this is like an Arduino Mini with these really expensive micro-mo motors. I mean, the motors are really the most expensive part because you have to, otherwise they're too fast basically. And then the hull is 3D printed, and all we do is it's essentially a remote control. So we have a big computer, a desktop computer, and we send the motor commands to the vehicles.
Navigation is your mocap system.
Right, so the localization is the mocap system. Yep, absolutely, yep. Yeah. And so we build all of these in-house because it's hard to buy anything that is commercial at these scales.
In the epic nerd movie, I think it was called Twister, the one about tornadoes. So they just threw a bunch of passive things.
Yeah.
Why does that work for you?
Well, we do, so that's what oceanographers do. So these Lagrangian drifters, they're essentially passive drifters. And the nice thing is you can actually set them at different depths. The problem with that is they're about $1,000 each, and so oceanographers tend to like to get them back. and so the problem is, and then, you know, there's other ITAR and sort of environmental issues of, you know, that.
But couldn't you do something much, much cheaper?
So these Lagrangian drifters tend to have a GPS link to it, and that Iridium satellite subscription or connection is not that cheap. And so I think you can. There's a lot of interest in trying to come up with cheaper version. There is, and so people are trying to do that. I think the question is really convincing the oceanographers to use them, and will it actually capture, you know, the measurements that the oceanographer wants?
I think you should just put stuff in people's trash. Go out and do tracks.
Right.
Everything you need to know.
Right, so you just like, you know, RFID tag every last piece of trash.
Realtor enough. So again, let's thank you one more time.
Thank you very much.